Okay, so I'm taking you on a walk to look at my quote-unquote poster child property, and I have been dealing with this property since 1974. And we're going to look at the different silviculture methods, look at the reforestation, and I'm going to talk to you about my silvicultural approach to managing this property, which is the use of what I call a functional thinning, which is a thinning that is not based upon spacing or diameter, but is based upon form and height of the tree. And we'll go look at some examples of what has happened here. Let's move on a little bit further. All right, so this plantation was planted back in 1983. My two sons planted it, and after that they decided they don't want to be foresters anymore. And my client's nephew lives on the property, and he's the one that pruned all the trees. They wanted the trees pruned, and if you can see that red mark behind you, that's the first trees that we're going to start thinning out of this forest, and they're the ones that the chipmunks or the squirrels have been taking the tops out of. So that's what we're doing here. The idea of this plantation is we haven't thinned it until now, because what we're trying to do is get the trees to slow down in diameter growth, put on more height growth, and then that way we end up with at least a 32-foot log out of each tree that we're gonna take out of the thinning. And as everybody knows, you get paid for the small end of the log. So we want to get as much taper out of the tree as we can before we harvest it. The thinning, we had to work with the nephew, but we leave about a third of to half the crown when they do the thinning. Okay, so this area was an old field. It'd been converted. When this property was logged back in the early 1900s, this area remained a field, and a little further up the hill, it evolved into brush. And that's where the big timber forest is. This area here, I asked my client, do you want to continue to try to use this as pasture? And he said, no, all this property from the county road on will be devoted to timber. So we cleared a few remaining trees, and we planted this plantation all along this flat that in here, and it represents about a third of the property. We had an interesting experiment. We used a auger to drill the holes, because it was a lot of compaction. For 100 years it had been pasture, and the auger actually kind of compacted the soil further down, so it took a long time for these trees to finally release. My client came up with a different approach across the road, which we won't see, but there he took and ripped the property crosswise, and each time the rip came together, they planted a tree. And that plantation is probably about 15, 20 years younger, and it's almost the same size as this plantation. So that preparation makes a difference. This area has all been all these trees have been pruned. This was planted in about 1985 by my sons, and then we got these red marks on these trees, and those are trees that we're going to cut in the next year or two. It'll be the first of a series of light thinnings that will go through this plantation to get it. And you can see there've been some trees cut, and you can see the sprouts already starting to come up there. And these trees were planted using an auger. We have another plantation across the road that they used a tractor to rip the soil, and they ripped it crossways and they planted in the crossways, and where they planted in the crossways, those trees are grown almost half the size of or almost the size of these, but they're about 20 years younger. So that site prep is very important to doing it. We don't do too many plantations, so we're sort of learning about it as we go. Interesting thing about it, the Doug fir all comes in here, and it's like an undercoat, almost a little carpet of Douglas fir comes in under this redwood. We've also found that the redwood grows better when it's in association with the Doug fir, and you can see some Doug fir that's in here that are all natural trees that weren't planted. But having some Douglas fir with the redwood tends to make it grow taller and faster. So there is a symbiotic relationship between the redwood and the whitewoods. The Doug fir will grow faster than the redwood seedlings, and the Doug fir will grow faster than the redwood seedlings. As you get closer to the coast, the salt air, the whitewoods tend to do better tolerating the salt air, and the redwood doesn't do as well. If you go into these stands when they're a little older, you notice that the tallest trees in the stand will be Douglas fir, grand fir, and Sitka spruce, and the redwood comes along later. It's always a little bit under there. So I've always, in the old days, we got the bright idea of cutting all the whitewoods out and leaving the redwoods, and I got chewed out. My boss, Mr. Merrill, came along and a couple of years later and said, "What's the matter with those redwood trees?" And I said, "I don't know." And we bored them, and they had almost stopped growing and no more height growth. And I said, "Well, you told me to cut all the whitewoods out of there." And he proceeded to chew me up one side and down the other about that. But it's not always the case, but normally if you leave some whitewood in with the redwood, it seems to always do a little better. I think they grow better because it gives them more competition for height, and the whitewoods tend to shelter the redwood from the winds and stuff, and the redwood, I don't think, tolerates the wind like the whitewoods do. That's my observation. So if you look at that redwood log there, you'll see the dark part and you see the white part. And the white part is the sapwood. Okay? That's the growing part of the tree. The red part, or the dark part, is the xylem, or not the dead part, but it's the part that draws water up. But that red part is the part of the redwood that has I call it the poison, but has the preservative qualities of redwood. And so the object is, if you can grow a redwood tree, with a high percentage of heartwood or redwood or dark wood like that, it's a more valuable commercial tree. So my theory is that using our functional thinning, which is to grow height instead of diameter on the tree, is that there'll be a change in the relationship between the heart and the sapwood. And that one, you get a little bit tighter grained log that comes out of the tree, and you should get a higher percentage of heartwood. Now, I don't have a sawmill, and I don't know how valid that theory is, but I do know that we get always get a very good price for our logs, and I have been told by the log buyers, because you can't always believe the log buyers, but me being one, I know exactly what they're doing. But they do mention that it is a nice log and that they do get quality lumber, and I'm inferring from that they probably do get a little higher percentage of heartwood from it. But that's the theory, is we're not trying to grow as big a tree in the diameter, but we're trying to grow a taller and better formed tree, if that makes any sense. Okay, so the idea about the heartwood and the form of the tree and the came from a request I got from a very knowledgeable old mill guy. And he told me, he said, I want you to go out and buy me a couple of million feet of 70-year-old redwood, and I don't want it to have any stump sprouts in it. Well, that's almost impossible to do, because you can't, 70-year-old second growth redwood with no stump sprouts is impossible. But then it occurred to me that really what he meant was, and by about 70 years, an uncut stand of second growth redwood is starting to develop a pretty high percentage of heartwood, which was and so it said, okay, the heartwood, and it's old enough to have slowed down so that the grain, the number of rings per inch are down to, say, 6 rings to the inch. And the reason he says don't get any stump sprouts is because the stump sprouts are the ones that have the real coarse grain, because they grow so much faster than everything else, and there's nothing to help prune the tree. So that's where I got this idea that putting all this together, if you had a slower growing diameter, that would, quote, take care of the no stump sprout situation, and you worked on this height versus DBH, you would tend to get a tighter grained, higher quality log out of the tree, and you still get the volume increase for your client, because the tree got taller and it had a better form. So that's where it came from. It's not necessarily intuitive. It's one of my crazy ideas. Okay. Okay. This is an area that we started thinning in 1974. And we have thinned this timber out for, I think, 5 entries. The last entry was last year. So we thinned this property last year. And the yields have been incredible. We started out with, this total property had about 1.5 million feet. We've logged a little over 1.5 million feet. And our latest inventory shows about 3 million feet. So this thinning process, light thinning of 30%, 40 at the most, sometimes as little as 20%, done every 5 to 10 years, has yielded what you see behind you here, and that's the function. And if the camera will show, it'll show you these incredible heights for this incredible site, and that's what every single tree here now is the best of the best. And we are now at a point to where we no longer have trees. Every tree is a good tree, so we no longer have undesirable trees left in this stand. And the growth rates are probably around 2,500 board feet per acre per year. So this is the thinning. The objective is to find about 30% of the trees are probably doing 80 to 90% of the growing. And the object is to figure out which one of those trees is growing, is doing most of the growing. And then you start thinning out the other trees. And you can't cut them all at once. If you cut them all at once, then you have problems with bears, problems with blowdown, and other factors like that. So you have to go through there and just systematically, over time, keep thinning out these undesirable trees. And each time you come back, sometimes the undesirable tree has now morphed into a desirable tree, and the other way around. So it's just a slow maintenance of developing this forest into what its potential would. But instead of taking hundreds of years, you're able to do it in probably 3 or 4 decades. So that's the key to this. And what you do is you select the trees to leave, and then you have another 70% of the trees to pick from to see which trees you want to cut. So that starts into then just being an engineering problem. Which tree will fall that's easiest to log, and you don't have to worry about spacing or skinning the other trees up. Your logging costs go down. We put the infrastructure in ahead of time, and we keep that same infrastructure, and we just always use the same infrastructure, skid roads and landings, and then we just come in periodically and fall what trees we're going to cut, harvest, and take them to the landing and ship them to market. Our economic model is based on the fact that we establish the growth. We say from that we decide on our allowable cut. In other words, the growth or less, usually it's less. And then we pick the markets during the decade, everything the same. We let the trees grow on the poor markets, and we cut the trees during the good markets. And that, of course, is beneficial. And we have to have some flexibility. Sometimes our client comes and says, well, we need money. So then we may go in and we may cut, trees at maybe a market that we didn't like to, but we still have that overriding how much we're going to cut. And then at the end of 10 or 15 years, we come back and we remeasure the forest. And if we've got as much or more than when we started, that's the objective. So, and it's been a very good tool for managing these properties. Our clients are happy. They look like great forests, and they all produce income. Okay, so the fun thing about this piece of property is that you almost get to manage it tree by tree, or at least small group by small group. And there's a couple of things that you can get away with. And one of them is, because you have such a fast growth rate, you can afford to maybe not leave so many trees sometimes. You're dealing with trees that are, the remaining trees you're dealing with, they're best form. They're going to do the exhibit the best that this site has to offer. So what we do, we have a couple of rules of thumb. And the first rule of thumb is that you want to maintain or increase the growth. So when my new foresters come out and they say, how do we mark this, Jim? I said, simple. You mark it any way you want to, just as long as you maintain or increase the growth, which of course is enough to drive them crazy, but that's okay. We show them how to do that. Now, Bill's question is, and there's some areas, I don't know if we'll walk far enough to find, that we've come to, in which we now have a lot of scattered bigger trees. And scattered is a relative term. And we, as human beings, tend to always look about 4 feet above the ground and lower. But if you look up at the crown of the tree, and if those crowns are still close together, even though these trees are spread way apart, you probably are still maintaining the growth. You know, it's a combination of basal area requirement, but there's also the V-bar, the volume per basal area, and that's the other key component, and the crown of the tree. So that's another component. Now, you do come to that point to where, okay, maybe we should cut them all down and start over again. There's another key element that you can look at, is that you probably need to reduce the canopy to about 25% in order to start getting, and this place will have nothing but little seedlings after each logging, to start, and stump sprouts, to start getting the enough light or photosynthesis for those small trees to start growing. So obviously, if they're starting to grow really well, then you better look to see if maybe I should be taking off the bigger trees. In this case, in some instances, my client has told me that he doesn't want any more group cuts. He says, I want to keep the big trees. He wants to harvest the big trees, but he doesn't want to harvest them all. So what I have done in that case is that we probably don't keep enough big trees on there to capture the site. But we have now opened the site up enough to where now starting to get smaller trees that are starting to come in underneath. And in that case, we actually are starting to develop a true all-age managed stand. So that's, I think, what we're evolving into. So Bill, that is a long way of skirting and giving you the exact answer, because there is no exact answer, but if you take all those into account, that's how you make your decision as to what to do. Or you can have somebody from the Santa Rosa office of the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection tell you how it should be done. All right. Anyway, so that's what we're 25%, 50%, 75%. Mm-hmm. And they never got any regeneration to grow until they had cut 75%. They were testing to see the response of the overstory.
Yeah.
But they also happened to mention that the understory started to grow at 25%. And it was at that point that I picked that number, that I know that it's less than 50%. And so that's where I came up with 25%. Yeah. I mean, it probably depends on a lot of things, but somewhere you have to get, enough light down through this forest in order to get the
I'm shooting over your shoulder, Bill.
Oh, okay.
That's the idea. Don't run away.
all right, there you go.
You're having a conversation. I'm shooting over your shoulder.
Have the conversation, Bill. That's going to make
thinking
it
that I'm in your way.
We have a little.
you're doing
I'm
good.
trying to include you. This side of you.
When have you ever been shy, Bill, about talking?
I'm always shy.
Go right ahead.
I'm familiar with that thinning study they did, but
Yeah.
I had not read some of the more pertinent stuff about when they started to get understory and regeneration.
Well, they just entered that as kind of just happened to mention it.
Yeah.
But I picked up on that, and I said, because I know that we're always having these arguments about how all these, that all age management, you're supposed to be getting all these trees to grow up underneath it. And yeah, they're alive and they're still there, but they're not growing, and that's always been. And then all of a sudden, they do start growing, and then I start saying, well, okay, how did that happen? Well, pretty soon, yeah, if you get enough light, and I know the pruning makes a difference. So if you get enough light in there, then it goes. And then this Jackson State Forest, the guy just happens to mention, oh, by the way, when we cut it 75%, all the sprouts started growing. Well. Okay, so put 2 and 2 and 3 together, and and you got 7, and that's where I came up with this idea, and it seems to work.
Yeah.
So that's how I came up with that idea.
But as far as a group selection, it have demonstrated it works there in the groups where you're getting enough light. And how big a group really do you think?
The group, you're actually confined by the forest practice rules, and I think on this NTMP we're limited to 2.5 acres.
Right.
Well, 2.5 acres is damn near a football field.
It's a big. Yeah.
And so the other thing that you notice is that, well, part of our owl thing that we have to put up with is we're limited to 1 acre. And so a lot of times when we put in the groups, we like to plant our groups sometimes, and I just don't bother planting anything within 25 feet of the edge, because those trees never mature. You go back in there 20 years later, and you think there's something wrong with the soil or something. You got trees in there, 15, 20 feet tall, and you got still these little old tiny trees. And what it is, it's that 25 feet from the edge of that forest is still all compromised by the shade of the adjacent trees. So so you know that shading is going to have an effect. So that's what the. And even then, everybody says, well, you got the tolerant and intolerant species. Well, if you take spruce, it's supposed to be a very tolerant species. You go in here, and if it's got this shade canopy that we got right now, they'll just be a lot like that.
Yeah.
Now, they'll respond if you cut the trees, but that's how it is. Behind us, there's a redwood sprout that's probably 6 feet, and it's probably 20 years old. And it's not doing any good at all.
Yeah.
But it's because of that shade.
Yeah.
It's the same old story. They got to have light. If they don't have light, they're not going to grow.
Yeah, light, water, and nutrients.
Yeah, no, it's that balance.
Yeah.
But this forest, there was a silviculture teacher at Humboldt named Dale Thornburg. And Dale Thornburg had this theory, and I think he's right. He said there's no such thing as even age and all that sort of thing. He said, no, that's just, no. He says it's all height. Just think about it. Everything's height. Every one of these trees is going to try to seek the height of the site capacity. They are all going to do that, and that's all it boils down to. All this business of, well, just like at Plantation down there, we saw trees this big and trees that big, and they were the same age, but they, just had a different setup, maybe some genetics or something. But that's what he always did, and when you're trying to do this thinning, if you think about height management, then it all fits together. That's mine. And now you see if you can get that in a forced practice rule. That's not going to fit much modeling, but it does work. The best times we've ever had out here on these field trips for this place is when we have somebody like Bill or some, who starts asking questions, because you can never think of all the different things that you want to bring up, because it's so complicated. But if you get somebody to ask you a question, then you start, oh, okay, you want to know about that, or that. It's the same thing I was telling you about that a while ago. We said, oh, everybody ought to know that, Well, not everybody knows that, or not everybody's thinking that way, and it's a different way of looking at things. You did take these pictures of these trees, and one of the problems we have with them being so tall is when we log them, they tend to shatter. Redwood does not break, it shatters. And if you consider that a number of these trees might be worth $1,000 on today's market, and you break 20% of that, that's $200 a tree. So you can take time to fall this correctly. And what we do in this operation, the landowner actually, well, he thinks he's a timber faller, but he did get an old timber faller out here that felled old growth, and he started learning from him. And now we actually hire a certain timber faller every year when we log, and pay the guy by the hour, to take his time to, and it's quite a show when they come up here to do it. Now, it's against the law to build the layouts that you need, layouts with the tractor. It's against the law to do. But sometimes you can do a timely water bar that might help the situation. And the other one is to drag maybe some old top or part of a tree in there and fall it on there. And it's made a little bit of difference on the breakage, but with this second growth, it's really been hard. See, Louisiana Pacific, Hammond Lumber Company, and Georgia Pacific all tried to free fall old growth redwood. And then they built the layouts. The layouts, they are, as I said, they're very disruptive to the site. And but the difference was 25% recovery each time they did that. So it was, but that is the one disadvantage to what we're doing, is growing these tall trees. It's very hard to utilize them. So anyway, that's but by going slow and picking out which one to cut, because a lot of times I'll mark a tree and I'm not that good a timber faller, and my client will come along and say, well, we're going to cut that one instead of that one. Well, it's okay because they're all good trees, so it doesn't make any difference. The question
Jumping
was
ahead here.
that none of this fits a prescribed forest practice rules, which are all somewhat generic based upon compromises done at the Board of Forestry, etc. And unfortunately, it's a very time-consuming process for us to come up with you can propose a special rule, but it takes a lot of time and effort. And I know I got into an argument with Leslie Markham down at Santa Rosa office, and Leslie's a very nice person, and I wasn't a very nice person trying to explain it, so we finally just compromised and said, I just told her, I said, this is a selection. So it does fit the stocking requirements of the selection. The selection requires that you have a certain basal area, certain size trees, and certain number of age classes, and we do all those. We probably get to that point not the way that the rule intended for it, but that is the substance. It is not the process. So that's how we came up with that.
So you have an NTMP on this property?
This is an NTMP. It's one of the earliest NTMPs.
Yeah. So what you're saying is essentially the minimum basal area targets for selection don't necessarily inhibit your management of this property.
Right.
Because you're never going to manage to that level of basal area anyway.
We could end up managing to that level if we had an area that we wanted to group select, or an area that, I mean, there might be an occasion where that might be, but it would be the minor occasion.
Yeah.
All we're doing is saying that we will satisfy the requirements of that regulation. Now, the authors or whoever it was intent of how it was going to work are going to be probably not how we would come up with it, but in the end, the inspector can come out and say, yep, this fits the selection.
Yeah, because it just establishes a minimum, and these redwood stands at 75 square feet wouldn't be near this productive. I mean, what is the basal area you have out here? 300. Just a minute. It's fine. My thumb's not as
It's
good.
about 200 right here. Yeah, maybe if that guy's in there, it might be 240. This stand runs, I'm really careful about telling this because I can see it coming back on a review team question. You said this and such. I'd be like Trump or somebody on the thing. But there's a certain basal area that is in excess of the forest practice rules that is our trigger, that basal area, if we're at that lower basal area, we need to think about a different kind of silviculture. It'll still fit the regulations, but it might be more of a group. But generally, this stand in here is going to average 180 to 240 to 250. I've got some of them. It runs 400. Got some of it, as you can see over here. It's not going to run. It probably is less than your 75 basal area. I mean, it could constitute a quarter-acre group if you wanted to do it, or if you want to include that whole thing. That's an interesting point. When you're in the woods, you tend to overestimate acreage size. And I've gotten foresters that have been ready to kill me. Because you'll go through here and you go look at something. Hey, how many acres are we looking at? Oh, I think it's 4 or 5 acres. You know, you go, what the hell? You're probably looking at an acre. I mean, there's something to do with the human eye not being able to judge when it's in a forest. It's like leaving a scenic strip. Most people like to leave a scenic strip with about 4 or 5 trees deep of uncut trees, and then they cut all the trees in the back, and it looks like a scenic strip with a bunch of trees left and everything's cut in the back. If you take and you stagger the cut the first tree right next to the road if you can do it, and you leave one behind it, another one behind it, and you cut another one behind it, because you don't have any depth perception. So you can cut everything in there. It's like here, if you look at this forest, you don't think anything's been cut. And there was a fair number of trees down here that were cut last year. It doesn't look like, I mean, you just look at it just quick right now. It doesn't look like anything's cut. You go down there, it's because it's your eye, your depth perception is. Anyway, that's another hard lesson I learned. Oh, I know where that came from. That's from my horticulture class at Texas Tech, in which we had to do landscape design. So this is an area in which there was a preponderance of very large Douglas fir trees. And we took those out, and we took a few redwoods. And this probably would have been what we would have done for a complete group selection. But my client didn't want to do that. He said, no, unless we can get a good price for small trees, no, then they're going to grow. I frankly thought, no, those fir aren't going to grow. It's going to all blow down, blah, 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 blah. Well, in reality, what happened was, yes, the little fir trees did grow. The redwood didn't blow down. And he's gone through, and you can't see it now, but he's gone through and planted an understory there of superior redwoods, plus we got all the fir reprod. And this probably is the beginning of probably a truly managed all-age forest. I mean, it will. I think the reason that the trees didn't blow down is because we'd gone through and thinned it probably 3 or 4 times, so the trees were now acclimated to this, to a radical change in their environment. So they're there, and the fir will probably get harvested over time when there's a good market or something like that. So it'll be there. But he wants a constant cover of large trees, and we're trying to develop large trees down there on the plantations, but of course that's a few years away. So we're still maintaining this larger forest up here. The overriding criteria is that we're still maintaining the value. We do an appraisal of this property every year. Had to give it to the bank, And so far, our value has stayed the same, even though we've harvested. Our growth has maintained, and in some cases it has increased. So we're doing what we set out to do. So and it's small enough to where you can come in and play with the trees. I know almost every one of these trees by heart now. So anyway, that's what we.
And a different client with a different set of objectives or goals may say, no, I'd like to regenerate this in redwood, and you could put a group in here and grow redwood and still have big trees on the rest of it as well.
Yeah, no, it's all in. It's back to that same people management thing. I mean, the forester knows, or hopefully the forester knows about how to manage the forest. But there's all kinds of ways to skin a cat, and that's exactly what you got to be able to do, is to figure out how to incorporate that into the picture. And if your client comes along and says, you know, I want to cut all the trees down, I guess you cut all the trees down, but you do at least make him aware that there are some other options. But this guy, as I told you, in 1985, no, it was about 1980, he inherited this property from his mother. Well, he paid her for it, but he inherited it. And he came to me and he said, well, everybody says I ought to cut the timber off and then sell it because and make it the subdivision down there. So I said, well, you obviously came to me because you want a different answer. He said, yeah, I did. What do you think we should do? I said, well, we need to look and see what you got. It's the same thing. Let's get an inventory. Let's see what we got. So I said, okay, the problem is, what are you going to do with the money? You got to pay, in those days, you paid 50% taxes. So you go take a big night in Reno and you're done, and then you got $125,000, and what are you going to do with it? Pay off a house note or something? I don't know. So you got to go invest it someplace. Well, I'll go find a piece of property invested in it. Okay, well, you think you're going to find another piece of property as nice as this?
As good as this one, yeah.
And you know it like the back of your hand. So he says, no. I said, okay, let's look at it this way. Is it pretend like this is a hotel? And we know how fast the trees are growing, and we can cut that growth, and that's like the rentals on a hotel. And so you just appraise it like you would be appraising a hotel or a piece of rental property. And this is the income that it will generate. And the other caveat is that it will continue to escalate in value, not only inflation-wise, but in the case of the timber, it's going to be growing at somewhere around 2, 3, 4%. And if we do the thinning right, then we get to take that off, and that might be another 2, 3% of the value. And we still haven't lost the growth. We still haven't lost the principal. And so you got a pretty good income generating facility here. You still got your property, and it's probably going to do as well as if you went downtown and bought a condo or something. So plus you don't have to pay any income tax on this timber until it's cut. So anyway, that's how this guy didn't take too much talking, but that's how this guy concluded that this was the best way to go. And we have a number of other clients, but everybody's got a little different angle that they want to pursue, but that's how it works.
You mentioned generational transfer sometimes can influence properties. Is this particular client, is he pretty well set in terms of that generational transfer? And
most people now are pretty well educated on how to protect themselves for the generational transfer
and protect the property.
Yeah, but where they fall down is they don't understand the property. They don't understand that principle of forest management. It's amazing how people look at, I mean, we don't have a problem with it, but most people regard a forest as fixed. And you cut it all down and you make money. And then what do? And that's how they look at it. And so when you start talking about all this other stuff, it's hard to keep their attention. And they got lots of advisors and lots of people there, and there's all these other things that go, and a lot of people, they're out of town, they just don't want to fool with it. They don't, some of them do. Now, some of them, they're just dying the wool. We want our forest, and we want to come look at it, and we love that it makes income and all this other stuff. And then, no, those guys are great, but so many of them have, it's just, somebody told me the United States, it's just very difficult to transfer assets more than 1 to 2 generations. I met a guy in, I think it was Massachusetts or a consultant in Massachusetts or New Hampshire. And he was dealing with a property that has 300 heirs. And it was put together by an old sea captain in the 1700s. And I said, holy moly, how in the world have they kept that apart? He said, every year we have a field day. And they come in with babes in arms to the old man that can barely move down the hill, doctors, lawyers, mechanics, beggars, everybody. And he said they have a big picnic, all that kind of thing. And then they have like a day or a half day or something of something to do with forest management. They may be talking about estate planning. The next year they may be talking about what tree to plant. They may just something about business. So they all become interested in what's going on. And he says, every time there's a generational thing, they already know what you're talking about. And that's the one thing that I have been troubled about with a number of our clients, is they just don't, it's hard to get, the other generation. They don't realize how. I was just thinking about one client that we lost, and there's not much left of what he had, and it just, he could not get. He got one member of the family, and she still owns part of the timberland, but the rest of them, it was just like Greek. I mean, they just didn't want anything to do with it. That was the end of that. And the craziest part was they had this really great producing timber, sold all the timber, went down to Goldman Sachs, bought stock and bought TIMOs, bought South Georgia plantations, and their property, probably today has doubled in value in about 5 years, and they could have gotten this tremendous income just off of the thinnings and stuff, but you just couldn't see it. Just could not envision how that could work. No, that's probably been the biggest frustration, is trying to get that education thing across to the
generational
people.
transfer.
Yep. It's been an interesting thing. So, the thing that worked for me was, this was modus operandi for how LP and GP did their thinnings for the whole 10 years I worked, or 11 years I worked for them. So it was not something that I didn't know what was going to happen. And when you don't know what's going to happen, that's when you have problems. And that's where a lot of these guys get into, because it was the rage to thin trees back in the 70s, but a lot of guys cut too much, or it all blew down, and then that was the end of that. Now here's another interesting thing that's kind of interesting. See that tree stump right there? Well, that's what I call the National Geographic tree. Because when we were out here with National Geographic, the guy wanted me to mark a tree. So I marked a tree there. He said, oh, that's great. And so he put that on the TV. Well, actually, in theory, that's probably against the law. Because this is a Class 2 water course. And you're supposed to leave the 10 biggest trees in the thing. So as to whether that was the biggest tree or not, I don't know. I don't know. So it was kind of a controversial subject for a long time. And then we cut the tree last year, and they didn't do too good saving it. But then we had a lady from the California Fish and Game Department came by, and she claimed that that was a violation. I was a taking of a salmon. So we had great argument about that. So anyway, let's go on down this road here, and we'll do some more talk. The thing that is a problem with this is that when you reclassify one of these water courses, the buffer strips are so sophisticated that, for instance, this road that's been used for 60 or 70 years would have to be abandoned in favor of another road right up above you, which would be all new disturbance, trees have to be cut, the whole works. And it probably might not be as stable as this road. But we were able to get a dispensation, or we worked out an agreement that they said, no, you can go ahead and use this road, continue to use it, but make this classification, but they'd give you that exception. So that was the real inconvenience with changing the classification. But we're still going to keep the substance, but we're now with the process also. So Wendy asked a question about wildlife, and we have quite a bit of wildlife here, and what makes this unique is all these different sizes of trees and openings and so forth. And that's what I learned in my wildlife thing about habitat. We used to call it the edge effect. I forgot what it's called now, diversity or something. And it does. It supports a pretty good amount of wildlife. The only thing that does slow it down is the size of the property, and you can see half of it is rural residential over here, so that slows it down. We have fortunately not had any spotted owls, although we probably are creating some pretty good habitat for spotted owls, but we just don't have the area for the owl. We have had some other species move in, and we do get spotted owls foraging here. And in fact, every time we log, we have a spotted owl shows up the day after we pull equipment, because there's lots of rats. We have ospreys that come from the river, and all kinds of mammals. The bears come in here, but I think they're attracted by the garbage cans and so forth. Although trees this size also are doing a lot of growing, and they will bring bears in also. So anyway, did that kind of answer your question on that? Okay, so that's what we're doing there. In a perfect world, what is my vision of an ideal forest? Well, I'll skirt around that one. It would depend on where it was, and it would depend on the society that was around it, and it would depend on what we were going to use it for. Is my forest going to be used for a wilderness? Is it going to be used for a park? Is it going to be used for a working forest? Is it a commercial forest? What part of the world does it live in? I guess the perfect forest is a forest that is adhering and respecting all of the ecological items that make up the forest. And if you're adapting this forest to take into account all those things, then that probably is the perfect forest. What is the perfect logging operation? The perfect logging operation is where you can come back 10 years later and be proud to show it. That would be my answer. To anybody. Well, you gotta get it one last picture of paradise here. Where's paradise? This is that perfect forest. This is perfect forest for here.